and welcome on back to another episode of the GSMC Football Podcast. As always, my name is Matthew Quinn. I am your host for this evening. I want to thank you guys for tuning in to the show. We have a great show for you today. We'll be covering some more free agency updates. Not a ton happened today, but a couple of little pieces of news and information that we're going to cover in the first segment there. And then as we continue on in the show, we're going to be covering our next two teams in our ongoing season outlook series. We'll be wrapping up the NFC North today with the Packers and then the Lions. And then make sure you stick around for it later in the show. I'm going to be talking about my top 5 favorite free agency signings that I've seen so far as we kicked it off a few days ago. Also, I've got a little mock draft for you, our continued series on that. We're doing picks 11 through 15 tonight, so stick around for later in the show for that. But before we start, I just would like to first of all just ask you guys that you like and follow the show. If you have a question or a comment or anything like that at all you have to do is just go onto the Super Chat, type in your question and your comment, and we'll get to it as soon as we can. As always, your input is a big part of what makes this show great, so we thrive on your energy and your insights, whether it's a quick comment, a thoughtful question, or an opinion that you just have and you just want to share it. Don't hesitate to drop it in the chat. Now, if you want to make absolutely sure that your message stands out and gets featured on the show, there is an easy way to do that. Just use the Super Chat feature. Just click the $sign at the bottom of the chat box to send your Super Chat. This guarantees that your message gets on the air, and it's also a fantastic way to support our channel. We rely on your support to keep bringing you sports content that you love, and we appreciate every bit of it. So just go ahead, let us know what you're thinking, hit that Super Chat button, and let's keep this show as interactive and as exciting as possible. And if you prefer, you can also go to GSMCsports.net to tip, donate, and leave a comment or a question there. We couldn't do what we do without your amazing support. So we're so thankful to have you guys as part of our community. And once again, that link is GSMCpodcast.net. So go ahead, type your question or your comment in the Super Chat, and we'll try and get to that as quickly as we can. So let's go ahead and get into our first segment of the day. We're going to just be going over a little bit of the free agency news that kind of took place today. As I said before, there wasn't a ton of news, but a couple of things did happen that I did want to cover. One of the stories that popped up, and I actually talked about this on one of my shorts earlier today, but Mason Rudolph is actually returning to Pittsburgh on a 2-year deal. Not the quarterback that everybody expected the Steelers to sign as far as news coming out. And this role, from everything I understand, is a supporting role of some kind. My own personal opinions and what I would like to see happen, because I actually like this signing as a Steeler fan. And what I would like to see happen, though I don't think it's going to, but I think the best deal for them to do would be to have Mason Rudolph be your pseudo starter this year, and maybe draft a guy because they don't have a second round pick, so maybe the third round, maybe Jackson Dart falls to the Steelers in the third round, or maybe they do some trades to kind of move up in either the third round or all the way up into the second round. Don't think that they would move up into the second round to get Jackson Dart. I think it's just kind of a situation where if he's there, they would draft him. But I think that would be a good course of action, because that kind of gives you at least a little bit of a plan at the quarterback position this year. Because right now the Steelers don't really have a plan. If Aaron Rodgers, if that falls through, which is a possibility that it could, because he could even end up retiring, and also who knows how long he's going to take to make his decision, and the Steelers may have their hand forced and they may have to go elsewhere for a quarterback, and rather than just wait on Aaron Rodgers to make up his mind, essentially. So I think they could get a quarterback in the third round to kind of work on. And also I've heard that maybe they could trade possibly for the Patriots backup Joe Milton and have him come in with Mason Rudolph. It's not the most glamorous quarterback room by any stretch, but that at least gives you some sort of hope or some sort of plan that you're going to go and get your franchise guy next year in the draft, most likely, when the draft is actually held in Pittsburgh. Like, how perfect would that be, that the Steelers get their next franchise quarterback on the first ever NFL draft that has taken place in Pittsburgh. That would just be, a crazy story. And I'm sure people would eat that up that entire weekend. And that could be what they're looking into doing. It's kind of up in the air. I don't really know what they're going to do. I originally thought that they were going to sign Justin Fields. That didn't happen. So now it's just kind of a matter of just wait and see. I personally don't think that they should wait on Aaron Rodgers to make his decision. They have other moves that they need to make, and they can't afford to wait for a 41-year-old quarterback who seemingly passed his prime or past his effectiveness. They can't wait on a guy like that to make up his mind. They have to make some moves. So I would imagine that a decision is made in the next week or so. I don't foresee the Steelers waiting weeks and weeks like Aaron Rodgers likes to do with teams. So I feel like they'll move on. But, that's kind of the update right now with what's going on in Pittsburgh. Still no real answer. Mason Rudolph there, that kind of gives you a little bit of stability. At least you have kind of a fallback option because he has started games for the Steelers before. Granted, in a different offensive system. He has not played under Arthur Smith's system. But, it's someone that everybody there is familiar with. So I could absolutely see him getting some playing time regardless if they sign Aaron Rodgers or not, because I have a hard time believing that Aaron Rodgers is going to make it through a full season, especially with that offensive line in Pittsburgh and not having an ability to, move like he used to back when he was in Green Bay. So that's kind of all the news there. As far as the other big name quarterback that's still out there, Russell Wilson, he met with the Browns today. There's no real news as far as how that went or anything like that. He's scheduled to meet with the Giants tomorrow. He met with the Giants last offseason, or at least was going to meet with the Giants last offseason before he ultimately signed with Pittsburgh. So, it would be kind of interesting to see him actually decide to go to the Giants. Going to the Browns would be kind of strange, in my opinion. Just not because he used to play for the Steelers and now he'd be on a rival, but, they traded for Kenny Pickett. And obviously Kenny Pickett is not a franchise quarterback by any stretch, but when I saw that trade, I just assumed that Kenny Pickett was probably going to have a real shot to be the starter there. But clearly the Browns don't believe that Kenny is starting material. Otherwise, they wouldn't have taken an interview with Russell Wilson, in my mind. So he could sign there. It wouldn't surprise me. I still kind of feel like Russell Wilson is going to have a contract after he meets with the Giants tomorrow. That's just my personal opinion. But we'll see. He could go to the Browns, and that would be interesting to have to face him twice a year. Browns are not really super threatening, but, neither are the Steelers. So it would probably be a pretty interesting game. And AFC North games are always, close games anyway. So, yeah, that's what's going on with those guys. Let's kind of move on to a little bit more NFL stuff rather than just Steeler-based things. The Eagles today, they signed cornerback Adoree Jackson. They signed him after, of course, the departure of C.J. Gardner-Johnson a couple days ago. So they're trying to shore up their secondary a little bit. Obviously, they still have the young corners in Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, so they're not really hurting for corners there. And adding Adoree Jackson definitely is a good little replacement type of move, to get, in place of C.J. Gardner-Johnson. He's not on the same level as C.J., but, this at least affords them some depth on the back end there. So, good move for the Eagles overall. I expect much more moves to come. I expect them to address their defensive line heavily in the draft like they have done over the past few years or so, seemingly. They always go after a really good defensive lineman that ends up being, very good. And in this case with the Eagles, a couple of the guys that they have on their defensive line have already moved on in free agency. So they need some bodies to fill that roster. So it wouldn't be surprising if they went to the draft to try and do that. Another backup move that happened was Chiefs signing former Raiders and Colts quarterback Gardner Minshew. He will obviously be backing up Patrick Mahomes, but in case there's an issue where Mahomes gets hurt, you do have Gardner Minshew who has starting experience there. So I think that's an upgrade over their previous backup when they had Carson Wentz last year. So it was only a 1-year deal. They got Gardner Minshew, not a ton of money, and that's to be expected for a backup. So solid depth piece signing there for the Chiefs, just in case, something were to ever happen to Mahomes. They would still have a relatively decent quarterback, or at least a competent quarterback to, hold the reins down on that offense. A couple of other moves. Raiders added some running back depth. They went ahead and got Raheem Mostert from the Dolphins. He spent a year in the Dolphins system. Of course, he was formerly with the San Francisco 49ers, and now he is in Vegas with the Raiders. Obviously, we talked about the Raiders a few days ago when we were talking about their season outlook, and then, of course, the mock draft when I picked them to go Ashton Genty with their 4th overall pick. And that's kind of where I see them going still, even with Raheem Mostert signing today. He's not a franchise starting caliber running back, at least not anymore. He's kind of a depth sort of running back, a guy that you can come in on third downs or give your running back a breather or, whatever the case. But I still think they have a need for running back there despite that signing. Russell Wilson, as we mentioned before, went to the Browns, so we won't get into that again. The Dolphins, they added to their offensive line today. They went ahead and they signed former Steelers right guard James Daniels. James Daniels was solid for the Steelers in the couple years that he was there. This year was kind of unfortunate because he did have an injury that kept him out the rest of the year that he suffered early on in the season that kind of set that offensive line in flux. There were a couple of other injuries on that offensive line that happened in training camp too that kind of set them back. Then they had their number 1 overall pick from last year, Troy Fautanu, who tore his ACL and then he was gone. So, James Daniels was a big part of that line. He was solid when he was in the lineup. So I think the Dolphins are getting a solid right guard there. So they should, as long as he can stay healthy, that should be a decent signing for them. Speaking of offensive linemen, Patriots releasing their longtime center David Andrews after 10 seasons with the organization. He will, I'm sure, get picked up in the next couple of days or so. He is still a starting caliber center and would do well on any team that, wants to bring him in, whether it be for depth or just want to have a veteran presence or a veteran starter in the lineup. He could succeed there. So that was just kind of another piece of news for the Patriots. He had 1 year left on his contract, and the one thing about him that kind of might have led to his release is he is recovering from shoulder surgery. So the Patriots could be looking into that and maybe wanting to upgrade that position via the draft or, something like that. So they released David Andrews, create a little bit of cap space, and we'll see what they do with that cap space. A couple more pieces of news here before we move on to the next segment. Mike Williams returns to the Chargers on a 1-year deal. He spent last year with both the Jets and later in the season with the Steelers. When he was with the Steelers, only had about 21 catches, not a ton of yards, 1 touchdown, which was that game winner against Washington. He didn't do really anything after that point, but the Steelers didn't ever really use him. And when they did use him, he made some pretty clutch, pretty incredible catches. I just don't really understand why they didn't use him more. And I think he goes back to a better situation in the Chargers, who actually need some receiver help. So having a guy that they're familiar with, and a guy who's been in that, maybe not that system necessarily because, Jim Harbaugh is the new head coach from last year and Williams wasn't there last year, but still he's used to being in that building and around some of the teammates that were there with him when he was originally on the Chargers. So I think that'll be a solid deal for them. He'll definitely get some more opportunities with the Chargers than he did with the Steelers last year. That is for sure. Another wide receiver acquisition that happened today was a relatively small one, but it's Olamide Zaccheaus from Washington, the wide receiver. He ends up signing with the Bears as the Bears continue to be aggressive in free agency and try and bolster that team as much as they possibly can, with Caleb Williams entering year 2 and a new coaching staff with offensive-minded coach Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator from Detroit from a year ago. So Bears making some good moves. We talked about them a little bit as one of my winners of free agency thus far, and this is just another kind of example of that. It's not a flashy signing, but it's a depth piece that will be useful for them. So I like everything that the Bears are doing thus far, and we'll see what they do come draft time, because they've addressed a lot of needs already. So it'll be interesting to see where they go in the draft. So, so that's kind of everything that happened in free agency today. Like I said, there wasn't a ton of news, but we got through, most of the most notable ones, So when we come back, though, we're going to get into our ongoing series, the Season Outlook series. We're going to be covering the rest of the NFC North today. So that's going to be the Green Bay Packers first off, and then later on we'll be covering the Detroit Lions. So stick with us. We'll be right back right after this break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome on back, everyone, to the GSMC Football Podcast, brought to you once again by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we go ahead and get into the rest of our show, just want to remind you guys that if you do have any questions or any comments whatsoever, you can go ahead and hit that super chat and type down all of your comments and questions, and we will get to them as soon as I see them or as soon as I possibly can. Definitely try and engage with the show. It always is nice to create a dialogue and maybe a little bit of a debate. Always makes the shows a little more interesting and more fun. So definitely do that. Again, GSMC Sports Net, or excuse me, GSMCsports.net, and type in your super chats right there. So let's go ahead and get into the second segment of our show. We're going to be doing our ongoing Season Outlook series. This time we're going to be covering the Green Bay Packers and just taking a look at what they did last year, just to kind of review before we really get into what they need to do the rest of this offseason. Finished 11-6 last year, third in the NFC North. They did, of course, lose 22-10 to the Philadelphia Eagles in the wild card round. Jordan Love kind of had, for the most part, a pretty decent year, but it was a little up and down because he dealt with injuries. He missed a few games. That first game against Philadelphia that was in Brazil, he actually ended up getting hurt in that game, and that loss to them. And that kept him out for a couple games to start the year. They had Malik Willis. He kind of held his own for the most part. He, of course, wasn't, Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or anything like that, but he was solid. He won some games for them, and he didn't turn the ball over too much. He was pretty safe with the ball. Of course, this being his second stop since being drafted by Tennessee last year, or excuse me, a couple years ago. But yeah, he was pretty solid for them. But Love overall finished with 3,389 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 11 interceptions. Now, the one thing about those interceptions is he had a lot of them early on when he was coming back from injury. As the season wore on, he got a lot better and a lot more careful with the football. And if you take a look at their overall stats on offense, that kind of backs up what I'm saying here. He was eighth, or excuse me, not just him, but the entire Packers offense was eighth in points per game, 27.1 points per game. So definitely effective there. They were fifth in total yards per game as well, and also fifth in rushing yards per game. So the offense did their job for the most part. And the defense was pretty solid too overall. They were top 10 in a couple categories, sixth in points allowed, fifth in total yards allowed. They were about middle of the pack in pass defense. They were 13th, but again, they were top 10 in just about every other category other than pass defense. Rushing defense was 7th in the league. third in the league in interceptions, seventh in the league in sacks. So both sides of the ball were effective most of the year. It was just they got hit with a couple of injuries, and then, of course, running into the Eagles in the playoffs when the Eagles were clearly the best team in the league last year, as proven with their Super Bowl win, of course. But so they still are a pretty good team. They just have the raw luck of being in a division that is by far, easily, hands down, the toughest division in all of football, and especially with the Bears improving this year and presumably going to be a lot better than they were last year. That division gets even more tough because you already have the cream of the crop of the division in the Detroit Lions. Then you have the Minnesota Vikings, who were very good last year. Admittedly, they have a little bit of, a few questions around their offense in particular with J.J. McCarthy, or maybe even Aaron Rodgers. There's been talk that they could sign Aaron Rodgers. I personally don't think that's going to happen, but I think they ride with J.J. McCarthy. That would be the best thing for them, since he is a first-round draft pick after all. You don't want to have him just sitting on the bench, for the good part of his early going in his career. He is, of course, coming off of that injury that kept him out all of his rookie season, so maybe they want to sign a veteran guy just for safety and security in case he ends up, not being 100% ready when the season kicks off, or, maybe he re-injures that knee or gets hurt again or something like that. They want to have a backup plan. They got pretty lucky last year having the backup plan that was Sam Darnold and having as good of a year as he ended up having. But, obviously they want to get better. So that's kind of the only questions really that they have. So if you take a look at the Packers, offensively, their running game is solid. Josh Jacobs is one of the better running backs in the league. He had 1,300 yards and 15 touchdowns last year. He also had a receiving touchdown last year, which may not seem like a big deal, but it was for him because that was his first ever receiving touchdown, and he's been in the league for a few years at this point, and he just had never had a receiving touchdown as a running back. Got one last year, and of course put up a lot of other good numbers with those rushing stats too. Their offense in terms of wide receiver is pretty much where their biggest need is. Neither of their receivers went over 1,000 yards last year. Their top two receivers anyway. Jaden Reed was essentially their number one receiver. He led the league in yardage, or led the team in yardage, And Christian Watson was there also, but he did suffer a pretty bad knee injury right at the end of the year. So you wonder if he's even going to be available once training camp rolls around. Most likely he'll probably miss training camp and maybe most of preseason if he's back at all in terms of being ready for the regular season. That remains to be seen. But I would have to figure he's going to miss some time as the training camp and all that stuff gets started in the next few months or so. In the secondary, they did have a few holes, but they were able to fill a good portion of that by getting Nate Hobbs from the Raiders. He was one of the better corners that was available in free agency, so they definitely helped their secondary that way by getting Nate Hobbs. As I said before, wide receiver is the biggest need, and Watson with the torn ACL at the end of the past season, that definitely makes it more and more likely that they're going to go receiver. Kind of surprising that they haven't really done anything receiver-wise in free agency so far, but there still are some players out there that they could go and grab, and I'm sure everybody's probably tired of me talking about Cooper Kupp with every team that needs a receiver, but he is available, and he has actually been linked to the Packers. They have talked to him, and nothing has happened as of yet, but I could absolutely see the Packers being the actual destination that Cooper Kupp ends up going to. They want to get a veteran guy, guy with experience, a guy with pedigree, and that is Cooper Kupp. He brings all of those things. And though he may not be in his Triple Crown winning phase of his career, he's still a very, very good receiver. And, he's solid, especially when you have those questions at receiver like they do. Wouldn't be surprised if they go receiver in the draft as well. They picked 23 in the first round. They need a true deep threat, and that's kind of why the Kupp signing, if they do end up signing Cooper Kupp or maybe even Amari Cooper, you feel like they probably still need to go after somebody in the draft, because Cooper Kupp, though he is a good route runner and is sure-handed as they come in this league, he's not necessarily what you would call a deep threat. He can get open down the field and everything, but he's not one of those guys that you would say like, oh yeah, you got to make sure you put a safety on the back end there to just kind of protect from the deep ball. That's not really his game. He's more of an intermediate route running kind of receiver, which would be good for the Packers, but they definitely need somebody who can stretch the field because Jaden Reed is more of a slot receiver too. So if you get Jaden Reed and you get Cooper Kupp both in the slot, you're going to need somebody on the outside to stretch the field. Maybe I thought that maybe they would consider trying to go after one of those big name receivers that were available earlier. A reunion with Devontae Adams was possibly in the cards. Obviously, he ends up going to the Rams. Maybe they could have went after DK Metcalf, but of course he ends up getting traded to the Steelers. So they could have made some moves, and they didn't. So it kind of makes me think that maybe they're waiting until the draft and maybe having somebody fall to them or maybe trading up to try and get their guy. While also signing a veteran receiver as well. I could absolutely see them doing that. They also need some defensive line help. There's not a ton left in free agency. There's a couple guys, Calais Campbell. He's, of course, a legend, in the NFL, but he's also 38 years old. So he's not getting any younger. And it's like, do you really want to spend money and cap space on a guy that, you don't know what you're going to get from him. 38-year-old defensive linemen, they don't necessarily stay in this league that long after that point. So, maybe they go after him. They could consider a reunion with Zadarius Smith. He just got released by the Lions this past offseason or this free agency period. So maybe they look that route. But they could also go in the draft with defensive line. And they don't necessarily have to go first-round defensive line. As we've talked about ad nauseum on this show, the defensive line draft class this year is very, very deep. So they could absolutely get somebody in the second or third round if they miss out on their guy in the first round. So I could see them doing that. As far as what I think their record might be, it kind of all just depends on the draft at this point because I think they're pretty solid overall. They're well coached with Matt LaFleur leading that team. Jordan Love, I didn't really think that he was as good as everyone made him out to be his first year as a starter, but he has proven that he can be consistent. And, though he may not put up the numbers that like a Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen puts up, he can still be effective and he's good in that system. It's the right fit for him. So, Jordan Love, it'll be interesting to see how he continues to grow and if he can stay healthy throughout an entire season as he had some injury issues last year. But if all those things fall into place, I could see the Packers, they were 11-6 last year. I could see them maybe going 11-6 again, possibly. Maybe get to 12 wins, with a surprise win. Maybe they get one over the Lions or the Vikings in the division this year. That's definitely a possibility with, division rivals and division matchups. They're always kind of strange. So you could have a good team playing a bad team and the bad team might end up winning. We saw that happen a couple of times in the AFC North with the Browns beating the Ravens and Steelers last year. So anything can happen. And of course, the Packers are not a bad team. So they just happen to play in a division that has a lot of truly, truly great teams in it already. The Bears are up and coming, so we don't know if they're great yet, but they can definitely be good. So I could see them going 11-6. That's kind of where I've got them at right now. Is a pretty similar record, actually the exact same record that they had last year, 11-6. The place in the division, that's going to be the interesting thing because that division is stacked, as we said. They could end up 11-6 and second in the division. They could end up 11-6 and bottom of the division. It's very possible for that particular division because it's just basically stacked and only getting better as the offseason continues. So, that's kind of where they're at right now. I could see them getting into the playoffs, but, I can't imagine a division with 4 teams gets into the playoffs. That just doesn't happen. I could see 3 teams from that division getting in. So one good team from that division will be left out. And it just remains to be seen as to who that team will be, of course. So that's what I've got for them. When we come back from another quick break that we're about to have here, we're going to be going into the final team in the NFC North, and that is the one that won the division last year and was also the number 1 seed in all of the NFC, and that is the Detroit Lions. So stick around. We will be right back, and we'll talk about the Lions a little bit.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
All right, guys, welcome on back to the third segment in our show. We're going to be talking about our season outlook for the Detroit Lions. Of course, they had a very productive year last year, kind of crapped out in the playoffs a little bit, which was disappointing for them, of course, but overall, they were one of the better teams in the NFL throughout the entire course of the season. They finished 15-2, won the NFC North, and got that number one seed that we talked about. They, had an electric offense under Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator, who is now in division but on another team with the Chicago Bears as the head coach. But take a look at their offense. It was almost unstoppable at times. That combination of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery in the backfield, they had over 2,000 yards rushing between them. And David Montgomery had about 700 or so, but he also did have a knee injury mid-season, so it kept him out of a lot of games. They could have absolutely had two runners that had over 1,000 yards, if not for the injury to Montgomery there. But Jahmyr Gibbs was electric all season long. He was very good. So that dynamic combo of those two, tough for anybody to stop. Obviously, every offense goes as far as their quarterback takes them. Jared Goff was fantastic last year, of course. He had a lot of help with his receivers, though, and don't forget his tight end that he has in Sam Laporta as well. But that offense was sixth in the league in rushing, but they were second in the league in passing and also in total yards per game. So that was a very efficient offense. They pulled out some pretty crazy plays. I know there was a fake fumble play that they did. I believe it was against the Bears. I could be wrong there. But it was a pretty crazy play. I remember when that happened. Nobody really knew what was going on, and they ended up, scoring on that play, I believe, or at the very least it was successful. So, pretty inventive ways to come up with offense. The Lions were always a fun team to watch last year. They only had the two losses. They had the one loss earlier in the year that made them 1-1, and then they only had one more loss again after that. So that just shows you how good of a team they were last year. When they got into the playoffs, it was pretty strange because they got in there with all of these expectations that they were going to be right there at the end, and then they get knocked off by the Washington Commanders and the upstart Washington Commanders team that came into Detroit with their young electric rookie quarterback, and they put up a lot of points on that Detroit Lions defense, which is a big issue that they need to address this offseason. I think that's where they need to spend most of their money and most of their draft capital is on defense, because that defense, for as good as the offense was, that defense definitely had some holes in it. Now, you could also say that defense was victim of a litany of injuries over the course of the year, especially towards the end of the year, but big names like Aiden Hutchinson, he got hurt. Alex Anzalone, their big, linebacker, big starting linebacker, he was hurt also, amongst others. There were tons of injuries on that on that Lions defense, so they were not done any favors by that. But it was a good thing that they had that offense, because despite the fact that their defense was giving up, 30, 40 points a game sometimes, their offense still, carried them to a 15-2 record. So that's just how good their offense was. Jared Goff, of course, as I said before, 4,600 yards passing, 37 touchdowns to just 12 interceptions. It's a pretty good ratio when you look at that way. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio, something like that. I'm not the best at math, so I apologize if that is incorrect. But Jared Goff, of course, continues to have a very good career post LA Rams or St. Louis Rams. in that case. But since he went to Detroit, they've had a different type of feel to them overall. And that could be, a lot credited to the head coach that runs the show, and that's Dan Campbell, who has been a very, very good head coach. Had his first year, not necessarily go great, but that put him in position to be as good as they are now, having that bad year in that first year. And that also proves the point of what I have always said, not necessarily on the show, but I've always said that you cannot afford to just give a head coach one season, especially on a team that's usually accustomed to being bad or struggling throughout the course of the year. You cannot sign a head coach and give him 1 year to work with, and then if it doesn't work out, you cut him loose. That is how teams like the Browns stay the Browns. You have to have faith, and you have to give your coach a chance to build his own version of the team and see where it goes that way. And if it doesn't work out, then you cut him loose. Or if something crazy happens, you have to cut him loose earlier or something like that, then so be it. But giving these head coaches, you see it across the league all the time, you give these head coaches 1 year, sometimes not even a year. You have them be head coach of a team that doesn't even have a quarterback, and then you expect them to be successful. And then when they have a bad year, it's all the head coach's fault. It's just ridiculous in my opinion. But the Lions, credit to them, they kept Dan Campbell despite the really bad first year, and they have, benefited from it. Of course, now it's at the point where they want to get over the hump in the playoffs. So it's starting to become a question of like, okay, so this is great. We've built a really, really good team so far, but when is this going to start paying off in the playoffs? We're great in the regular season, but when are we going to see it in the playoffs? And that's the biggest question for them. But, for as bad as the defense was in pass defense, they actually were pretty solid in terms of, defending the run. They were fifth in the league in rushing yards allowed. Now, you could also say that could be the case, or could be a little bit skewed a little because of how bad their pass defense was. Teams kind of want to target the weakness of a defense. Any, solid offensive coordinator, worth his salt will be able to, do that. Go after the weakness of the defense. In this case, it was the Lions secondary. So, they definitely need to shore that up as well. They did get some help, in that regard, I believe, but they're probably going to add some more depth pieces, or maybe some more starters or so as we get closer to the draft. Of course, they lost Carlton Davis, their starting quarter. So, they want to try and do something, kind of fill that hole as well. Also, in terms of the defense, one thing I forgot to mention, they had 16 interceptions, so they were fifth in the league in that. So they were opportunistic. So, you got to give them credit for that, but they just gave up a lot of yards. They, were able to get turnovers, but they gave up a ton of yards, and that kills you, ultimately, because you can't expect to get interceptions every single game and have that, basically be what you hang your hat on. So take a look at some of the things that they need. As I said before, they need some defensive line help, some depth on that defensive line, because you had Aiden Hutchinson go down, and that was a big loss for them last year. They could try and bring in some people to maybe shore up the depth. They did let go of Zadarius Smith in free agency, so they definitely need some players to fill up that roster spot there. Calais Campbell, as I mentioned before, he is an older option that they could bring in just to have a veteran presence in there, and maybe have him, sit behind one of the other guys or fill in, on an injury. He's not an every down player anymore, not at 38. Nobody is an every down player at 38 unless you're a quarterback. But they could possibly draft a defensive lineman in this class. As I've said before, and as I said earlier, defensive line class is very, very deep, so they could go after that. Another guy, because they could use some receiver depth as well, but another guy that I would kind of look at for the Titans receiver-wise is a guy that hasn't really been talked about a whole lot, but he is a free agent, and that's Tyler Boyd from the Titans. They could get him probably pretty cheap, as he wasn't very, effective in Tennessee. He definitely had his better years when he was in Cincinnati, and that's why the Titans ended up signing him, is because of how effective he was in Cincinnati, but it never really materialized in Tennessee. But then again, they didn't really have a quarterback situation, and they still don't. So you could kind of attribute it to that. That is not an issue with Detroit, though. They have a quarterback. Jared Goff will find a way to make sure that that guy is useful if they end up going that route. Guard could also be a draft option. They need some help that way because you take a look at their guards right now, that interior offensive line. Kevin Zeitler, he's 35 years old. He's not getting any younger. Graham Glasgow is 33, but he did have a bit of a down year last year, so maybe they want to add another piece to push Glasgow or maybe replace Kevin Zeitler whenever he decides to hang it up. And at the age of 35, as an offensive lineman, one of the more physical positions in all of football, in all of sports really, but in all of football especially, being an offensive lineman, you're in contact every single play. You're, hitting helmets every single play. So how much more can you take at the age of 35 playing that position? So they may want to get younger at that position, especially with Glasgow in his 30s also, just a couple years away from 35. So they're going to want to shore that up. Wouldn't surprise me to see them do that in the draft. As far as what I think the Lions will do as far as their record, they, of course, still have all of those players, all that talent. It will be kind of interesting to see how they respond having a whole new coordinator room because, of course, not only did Ben Johnson leave, but their defensive coordinator, Aaron Glenn, is now the head coach in New York for the Jets. So it'll be interesting to see how they manage that with a whole new offensive system and defensive system. I can't imagine it'll be too different, at least defensively, because Dan Campbell is a defensive-minded guy. So their defense might not be too different, but hopefully it will be at least improved, from last year, and hopefully they can stay healthy as well. But the offense is probably going to be relatively the same. I can't imagine it'll be that much different. They probably won't have these crazy inventive plays that Ben Johnson came up with a lot, but they'll still be very effective with the talent that they have on that roster. So I could see that. I don't think they'll get to 15 wins this year just simply because that division is very much improved already, and we're not even done with the offseason yet. So I could see them probably getting to about maybe 12, maybe 13 wins. I still see them. They're my favorite to win that division, of course. So I think they're still going to, take that crown. But they won't have it as easy as they did last year getting 15 wins. They had a ton of injuries, so it's kind of hard to say that anything was easy. But still, that's a successful year. But I can't imagine that they get 15 wins this year, not with the additions that all the other teams in the NFC North have made. So we'll see how they do, see how close my prediction is once we get the season kicked off. But as for now, that covers it for the NFC North on our season outlooks. We're going to be going a little bit south next episode when we're going to be talking about the NFC South. We'll break down that division. Of course, that division is, talked about maybe not necessarily in any of the right ways, because of what they have done over the past few years, not necessarily having a truly strong team in that division. So we'll get into those teams on our next couple episodes, but that'll do it for our NFC North outlook for the Detroit Lions. So just stick with me for one more second, and we're going to come back and we're going to talk about our fourth segment. It's going to be our mock draft. As we continue that, that'll be picks 11 through 15. So just stick with us. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
All right, guys, welcome on back to our next segment of the show. We are going to be getting into some draft talk. We're going to be doing a mock draft. We've done picks 1 through 10 already. Make sure you go back and check those out if you haven't seen them. But now we're going to be going into picks 11 through 15 as we get more towards the middle of the pack part of the NFL. With the 11th pick overall in this upcoming draft, we've got the San Francisco 49ers. Now, the 49ers, they could go a number of different directions here. I have them picking offensive tackle Kelvin Banks from Texas. He was first team All-American last year, first team All-SEC as well, won the Lombardi Award, which was the nation's top offensive lineman, and the Outland Trophy as well for the top offensive line, defensive line. And he was also named finalist for the Joe Moore Award. So, of course, he was very, very decorated in college. He shared the SEC Jacobs blocking trophy with a guy that we already talked about in a previous show, in LSU offensive tackle Will Campbell, who, of course, is ranked as the best tackle in the draft so far. But he did miss the SEC championship game with a left ankle injury, so that's something to keep an eye on. But the 49ers, they need some help with their big tackle, Trent Williams, not getting any younger. So they need to shore up that position on the offensive line. And with the type of offense that they run, it's a pretty run-heavy type of offense. And, a couple of screen passes, out routes, in routes, things like that. They mix up a lot of things under the Kyle Shanahan offense. So they need an offensive line that's going to hold up. Otherwise, they'll run into a situation that they ran into last year that they seemingly run into every other year, and that is just having essentially their entire team be injured. So that happened a lot last year. Christian McCaffrey being out for basically all year. He only played for a couple games, but basically all year he was out. That definitely didn't help. But, they definitely need some offensive linemen to continue what they are normally accustomed to doing, and that's running the ball very well and playing good defense as well, but mainly running the ball and, having strength in the trenches. So that's where I have them picking right now. So Kelvin Banks out of Texas, I think that is a solid pickup for them if they're able to go that route. Only time will tell, of course, but that's where I have them going. Next pick is number 12, and that will be the Dallas Cowboys. And the Dallas Cowboys, I have them going running back here, Omarion Hampton from North Carolina. Cowboys are basically long overdue for a franchise running back. Ever since that they had Ezekiel Elliott, when Ezekiel Elliott was like in his prime and, leading the league and rushing that Ezekiel Elliott. Ever since then, they haven't really had a real main guy. They've kind of, they had Tony Pollard for a little bit there. He moved on. They had Rico Dowdle last year. He wasn't a very well-known guy. He ends up moving on in the offseason as well. They did sign Javonte Williams from Denver, but as I said in the season outlook for the Broncos, I mentioned Javonte Williams a little bit there and how he wasn't necessarily what the Broncos wanted. So not saying he's a bad running back by any means, but he wasn't really that guy that's going to put the fear in you like a Saquon or a Derrick Henry might. So I still think that they need a playmaking running back, a really solid running back, and Omarion Hampton would be a good running back to pick up. He's a physical runner. He had a tremendous year last year. Take a look at some of his numbers. He was ranked third in all of college football with 1,660 rushing yards, and he had 2,033 all-purpose yards as well. And he also added 2 touchdowns receiving, so he's a multifaceted running back. He can do different things. So I could see the Cowboys really benefiting from that. If Ashton Jeanty is somehow still available here, that is who I would expect the Cowboys to pick. I already have them going. I already have Jeanty going to the Raiders in my earlier picks, so that's why he's not there right now. But if he is for some reason able to fall all the way to the Cowboys, they'd be foolish not to go and draft that guy. Run to the podium and draft him if he's available. But even still, Omarion Hampton is a pretty good consolation prize if you can't get Ashton Jeanty. And there's a ton of other running backs, so maybe they don't necessarily want to go running back with their first overall pick. I just have them going that because I think it makes the most sense. But they could go a different route because there's plenty of running backs they can grab, especially since they went and they grabbed somebody on free agency who will at least fill the running back room a little bit, But I still think they need that guy that kind of sets apart the rest of the team, especially in that division when you've got Saquon Barkley in that division. So you need to have a running back that can match or at least come close to matching how effective Saquon Barkley can be, especially when you play them twice a year. You need to have somebody who can kind of do the same thing that the Eagles can do. So I think Omarion Hampton would be a good fit in Dallas. Whether or not they decide to go and get him, that's a whole other story. I know Jerry Jones is a very complicated man, so he may end up going a completely different route than this and throw everybody through a loop and say that they're going all in when the pick doesn't even really make sense. And that's just kind of the Cowboys. But we'll get into the Cowboys in depth more when we cover them in the NFC East portion of our season outlook. That'll be coming up, I would think, sometime next week as we go through here. Moving on to the 13th pick overall, we've got the Miami Dolphins sitting here with the 13th pick. Now, if you take a look at what happened in free agency over the course of the last couple of days, they lost safety Javon Holland in free agency to the Giants. So that basically means that they need to get a safety in the draft, and luckily they're picking high enough to where they could possibly get Malachi Starks out of Georgia. That's who I have them picking at pick number 13. It would fill an immediate need. He's the highest safety in the draft, highest rated anyway. He has great football IQ, great athleticism. He can play multiple spots. He has speed, so he can, chase those deep routes or recover if he gets beat whenever necessary. He locates the deep ball very well, plays it with very good body control, and he was second team All-American last year, and he led the team with 77 tackles. So he's a sure-handed tackler, got a couple of things that he probably needs to work on, but for the most part, that is a very good safety. He could put you in the mind of a guy like a Minkah Fitzpatrick, somebody like that. He's that good. He could be potentially that good. So clearly best safety in the draft, at least in my mind anyway. So I think the Dolphins would be very, very well suited to go ahead and grab him as well. With that safety position, being a big need, they can't really go after anybody in free agency because all of the best guys are pretty much all, taken up by other teams or moved on to other teams. So, having him in the draft, having Malachi Starks, I think that would be a very, very good move for the Dolphins. And we'll see if they decide to do that, because they do need some other things as well. But right now I kind of have them going there. I think that makes the most sense with that draft pick. But, I'm not a draft expert. So, take whatever I say with a grain of salt. If you think that they need to get somebody else, then, more power to you. This is just, like I said, it's just my mock draft, just what I think that they should do. And Malachi Starks is a great player. So whether you think he, is not the 100% top need, you're still getting a very good player if they draft him. So, you can't be too mad about it if you're a Dolphins fan, if they end up going that route, of course. But moving on to the 14th pick in the NFL draft, I've got the Indianapolis Colts going Tyler Booker from Alabama. This, I think, makes a lot of sense just because they lost a couple key guys on that interior offensive line to free agency. They had Will Fries. I apologize, I might be pronouncing that wrong. I've been saying Will Fries for the past few days, and that's just in the back of my mind. I was like, is it Freeze? It might be Freeze, and I might just sound like an idiot by saying Fries. But anyway, I have them going Tyler Booker, Alabama, and of course they lost Ryan Kelly, the center, to free agency as well, so they do need to revamp that interior of the offensive line. Tyler Booker, taking a look at him, he was a 2-year starter and captain at Alabama, has the right size and strength that you want in a guard, has good technique, can get to the second level of blocks, move off of his first block and move on, and he's pretty good at doing that. He was first team All-SEC and second team All-American last year as well. And Alabama typically always has a very good run game, so he was a part of that as well. They didn't have as good of a run game as you're normally accustomed to seeing Alabama have back when they had guys like Trent Richardson or Derrick Henry back when he was running for Alabama. But they still had a solid running game, as most Bama teams do. So Tyler Booker, solid pickup if they were able to get him. That's kind of where I have the Colts going. With the 15th pick and the last pick in our mock draft portion of this show, I've got the Atlanta Falcons. I've got them going edge rusher, James Pierce out of Tennessee. They just recently parted ways with Grady Jarrett, who ended up signing with the Bears, so they do need some defensive line help. James Pierce was one of the better guys at the Combine in his position. He ran the fastest 40 time amongst all edge rushers with a 4.47 40. He was first team All-SEC, led the team with 13 tackles for loss, 7.5 sacks, played in all 13 games with 9 starts under his belt. He's an explosive pass rusher, He doesn't have a ton of size. He's not like one of those big, massive type of defensive linemen or edge rushers that you see, like a Myles Garrett kind of guy or something like that. But what he makes or what he misses in size, he makes up for in speed. He's able to get off the ball very, very quickly. He can get right at offensive linemen, catch them off guard because of how fast he is. So he can use, if he gets some more technique with his hand work and hand movement, he could end up being a very, very effective edge rusher in this league. And that is kind of where I see them going with that pick. I mean, there's many different things that they can go as far as the Falcons are concerned. Falcons have a lot of issues anyway because they've got the whole Kirk Cousins thing happening, and it's seeming like they're still going to hold on to Kirk Cousins despite the fact that they have Michael Penix there, and they ended up drafting Michael Penix in the same year last year that they gave Kirk Cousins a $108 million contract. So they kind of put themselves in a bind a little bit there with Kirk Cousins not ending up being what they wanted him to be coming off of that Achilles injury. They ended up going with Michael Penix. He showed some flashes, and there's a little bit of hope in Atlanta this year with Michael Penix as the starter. So having a good defense to back up rookie quarterbacks to keep him on the field and keep the defense off the field and give him more opportunities to get better and more opportunities to score will only help that team. And of course, with them losing Grady Jarrett, they had a huge hole that they needed to fill. And I think if they do end up drafting James Pierce, I think that'll be a good step in the right direction to filling that hole. Obviously, he's a rookie, so you don't know how long it's going to take him to acclimate to the NFL life and all that stuff. So that comes with any rookie, really, that you draft. But I think James Pierce, especially with the showing that he had at the Combine, definitely moved his draft stock up. There were a lot of other guys that I could see them going as well if they're available. Shamar Stewart, who I know I mocked to an earlier team, can't remember off the top of my head. I'd have to look at it, but I had him going somewhere else. But if he falls here and he's still available, I could absolutely see them going Shamar Stewart instead of James Pierce because he arguably had a better combine than Pierce did. Pierce was very, good with the 40, but Stewart was one of the faster times, amongst all edge rushers, but he also had the highest vertical and he tested well in a bunch of other areas as well. So if he's still available, the Falcons probably go him, but if not, if he goes where I think he's going to go, then James Pierce would be a pretty good, secondary option for them. So, yeah, so that covers it for the draft picks or the mock draft that I have. I'm probably going to do the rest of these picks over the next couple of days, couple of shows or so as we get into closer to the NFL draft that's coming up in just about a month or so. So we'll be doing picks 16 through 20 on our next show, and then, of course, keep continuing that until we get to the last pick of the draft. And so look forward to that. But that's going to do it for that portion of the show. We're going to take one more break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some more free agency. Only this time, we're going to talk about who I thought were the top 5 free agency signings over the past few days since the start of the legal tampering period, and then, of course, start of the new league year started. So we're going to go ahead and get into that, but we're going to take a quick break real quick. So just stick with us, and we will be right back. Welcome on back to the final segment of the show. We're going to be getting into my top 5 free agency signings that have happened up to this point. So going into it, there were a lot of different storylines going into the free agency. A lot of things have happened over the past few days. A lot of things still need to happen, in the coming days or so. But there were a lot of moves, a lot of head-scratching moves, but a lot of really good moves overall too. So we're going to get into some of the good ones. And then maybe tomorrow we'll get into some of the head-scratching ones. I don't know. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But as number 5, what I have as far as my free agency signings, my favorite ones, number 5, I have to put. And keep in mind, before I get into this, I feel like I should say that this isn't all necessarily free agent signings. This is also taking into account players that have been traded since the new league year started and everything. I just kind of wanted to merge those into all one category just to make it simpler, so people are not like, oh, hey, wait, this guy was traded, he's not a free agency signing, so I wanted to change things up a little bit, or just kind of make it a big generalization that it's just going to be anyone who is on a new team, essentially. So first pick, I have Laramie Tunsil, traded to the Commanders. I think that is a very good signing. That is number 5 on my list. That addresses a need. Of course, you want to protect Jaden Daniels after the year that he had as a rookie. Offensive Rookie of the Year, of course. Got to the NFC Championship game. And then, of course, was unfortunately kind of eaten alive a little bit by the Eagles' defensive front. So having a strong offensive line, especially in that division, is definitely necessary. So having Laramie Tunsil traded to them, and it was essentially a steal too, because they didn't have to give up much to get him, and it was kind of a head-scratching, and this is actually going to be probably on my list of head-scratching moves, only it's going to be on the side of the Texans, because I don't understand why the Texans traded Laramie Tunsil to them. He was their best offensive lineman last year, and the Texans don't have a very good offensive line, and he was by far the best player on that line. He was a Pro Bowler, great left tackle, and they let him go for essentially peanuts. They didn't give up. They didn't, get anything really for him. I believe it was like a 5th round pick. I could be wrong there, but it wasn't very much to get him. So the Commanders doing a great job there by getting a very, very high quality player for pretty cheap. So I liked that move a lot from the Commanders. Moving on to our next one, number 4, my 4th favorite one was Davante Adams to the Rams. And honestly, this could be a little higher. I kind of debated with myself a little bit before actually finalizing this list as I was getting it ready. Just because I was looking over all of the other free agency signings that have happened over the course of the past couple of days, and there were a lot of them. So it was a lot to get through. So my brain's kind of like mush a little bit after looking at all that. But I could have Davante Adams a little bit higher than this, but I have him at number 4 for now, which I think is pretty safe. It's top 5 still, so it's a good signing. Davante did not follow his buddy Aaron Rodgers, because Aaron Rodgers still doesn't know what he's going to do. So, good thing Davante Adams decided to make his own decision and not wait around for Aaron Rodgers like the rest of the world seems to do. But they have a 2-year deal going to the Rams for Davante Adams, and it is a big move for the Rams because they needed a big-time receiver after they released Cooper Kupp. And Cooper Kupp, of course, we talked about him before. He is a very good receiver still. He's not quite what he once was. He's had some injuries in recent years since he had that Triple Crown year when they won the Super Bowl. But, he's still a solid receiver, but they still need to fill that hole because they let him go. And who better to do that than Davante Adams? Now, Davante Adams is a little bit older in terms of receivers, but he's still very, very productive. He's still one of the better receivers in the league. You could probably put him up there, top 10 receiver in the league. I don't know if I'd put him top 5 anymore. Maybe in his prime I'd put him top 5, but not so much anymore. But he's pretty close to that level. He's at least top 10. So you add a guy like that, you put him into a place that has a proven quarterback, an elite quarterback, that Davante Adams really hasn't had since he had, of course, Aaron Rodgers in Green Bay. So he hasn't really had that. So having them go ahead and sign Davante Adams, I think, is a big move. So good job there. And obviously, we see in the chat here, love the Green Bay Packers. The Packers are doing a great job so far, and it's going to be interesting to see what they do, as we talked about them a little bit early on. If you didn't catch it, go back and check that out. But Adams, of course, going to a place with a proven quarterback, like we said. Matt Stafford decides to stay in LA after there was rumors that he could potentially go to Vegas and play for the Raiders. Obviously, that didn't happen, and he is still in LA, and a good thing, too, for Davante Adams, because he gets signed there, and he has a quarterback who will definitely make the most out of him to get the best use out of him as well. So good signing there from the Rams. So moving on to the next one I have here. I have the Chicago Bears signing Grady Jarrett from the Falcons after they released him. And that was kind of a surprising release in a way, because he's still a very good defensive lineman, still a very good player, and they freed up a little bit of cap space, and I feel like that was a big reason why they let him go. With all their cap space being tied up in the Kirk Cousins contract, they needed to free up as much space as they could, which unfortunately sometimes means that you got to let a player go that you don't necessarily want to let go. And Grady Jarrett was one of those guys, I believe, and the Bears did a good job sneaking right in right after he gets released and signing him and, pairing him with another great defensive lineman in Montez Sweat. So that defense will get even better, because that's the one thing you could say about the Bears last year. They weren't necessarily great defensively, but they do have some good players on that defense. So if they're guided in the right way, coached in the right way, I think they could get the most out of those guys. And having a big veteran like Grady Jarrett will absolutely help, at least that defensive front anyway. They've still got some questions on the back end, but they could also, add in the draft as well. They could add defensive linemen in the draft, deep class, as we mentioned before. So, they could definitely add in the draft. So we'll see what they do. But that's what I have them as number 3 overall. The number 2 signing is another defensive tackle, but this time it goes to the New England Patriots, Milton Williams. Big defensive tackle. He had a great season last year, of course, winning the Super Bowl with Philadelphia. He was one of the anchors on that great defensive front that the Eagles had last year. Big time, pass rusher and run stopper. Milton Williams is definitely up there as one of the top guys to get, in free agency. And a lot of teams definitely wanted him, but the Patriots, of course, were able to get him. And having him under new head coach Mike Vrabel, who is a defensive-minded guy, and that is going to just add more teeth to that defense, as it seems like they're trying to focus a lot on improving that defense so that'll put less pressure on Drake May, their young quarterback, while they still try and get some pieces to improve that side of the ball as well. But I think they did a very good job getting Milton Williams there, too. And they also got Harold Landry, too, from the Titans, which, by comparison is probably not a huge pick, but that's just another sign that they're trying to upgrade that defense. They also got Robert Spillane, so he was a solid player, played under Mike Vrabel when he was at Tennessee, as did Harold Landry. But Milton Williams, that's the big signing of the offseason so far for the Patriots, and that is their best signing in the offseason thus far. Obviously, still a long way to go. So we'll see if they decide to make any more moves or trades or, draft some defensive linemen in the, first round or whatever the case. But still, good job from the Patriots. They're definitely trying to build something there with Mike Vrabel. To the number 1 selection here in this list. And you guys may agree, you guys may not. I'm not sure. I apologize if you don't agree, but I have DJ Reed, the corner, signing with the Detroit Lions, signing for a 3-year, $48 million contract. And with the loss of their starting corner, Carlton Davis, this was absolutely a need, as we talked about earlier in the season outlooks of the Detroit Lions. They needed to shore up that secondary. DJ Reed does that with them for sure. And, he was the best corner available, or at least one of the best corners. I had him marked as the best corner. I've talked about him several times over the past few days on this show, trying to see where he could potentially end up because he was a free agent from the Jets. So DJ Reed goes to the Lions, a much more stable organization than what the Jets are. So hopefully he'll have more success there than he did with the Jets. So that's definitely something that they are, doing a good job at, trying to focus on their defense this offseason, which is what they need to do. As we mentioned to them before, or as we mentioned to you guys before, the Detroit Lions, for as good as they are on offense, their defense needs some work. Like I said, they had a lot of guys that were, hurting or got hurt, during the course of the season. But, for the most part, that secondary still needs to be shored up, especially when they lose their starting corner, Carlton Davis, like that. So DJ Reed's going to be a big part of that defense. And as long as they can stay healthy, and as long as DJ Reed can stay healthy and in that system, I think that the Lions could improve defensively. And if they improve defensively and they can still keep that same type of, mentality on offense, that creativity, that explosiveness that they've had over the past few years, if they can still keep that, some sort of semblance of that since Ben Johnson is gone, then this could be a team that could get past that first round, unlikely that they did last year, when they were knocked out in the first round, of course. But I think they get past that, if their defense stays healthy and if it improves, that could be an absolute team that I could see in the NFC Championship game again, since they tried to go there last year, were cut short, and before that, the year before that, they got to the NFC Championship game, had a pretty substantial lead on the 49ers before some head-scratching coaching decisions kind of made that whole game unravel. And since then, they came out the next season with a vengeance in the regular season, and it looked like they were going to get all the way to the NFC Championship game and most likely try and, take down Philadelphia, which would have been a crazy matchup, would have been an incredible matchup, really, to see those offenses going head-to-head, but that's kind of what they have to do. They need to increase that defense, or improve that defense, rather, and, maybe they'll get where they need to go, and maybe they can get over that hump and get to the Super Bowl, as, a lot of people are rooting for them, unless you're in that division, of course, but a lot of people are rooting for the Lions just because of how much they've suffered as a fan base over the course of, decades or however long it's been. It's been like since the 50s since they've won an NFL championship. So that was before the Super Bowl era, of course. But, they've had good players. They've had, Matt Stafford. They've had Calvin Johnson. They've had Barry Sanders. They've had a lot of really good players, but just have never really been able to put it all together. Or, whenever they did have those great players that I mentioned, they didn't have much else around them. But now they have the best team that they've ever had in franchise history. So they need to capitalize on this window that they have when they have, Jared Goff and Amon-Ra St. Brown, and their two running backs, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. All those guys, that's a loaded offense. They need to do something to capitalize on those players. So we'll see what they do going forward. But, yeah, so that should cover it for everything that I have for you guys today. I do appreciate, once again, as always, all of you guys joining me and sticking with me for, the whole show. If you did, I greatly appreciate it. Even if you didn't throw a comment in, I still appreciate you guys listening and taking the time out to listen to the nonsense that I have to say. So I do want to just go ahead and thank you guys, of course, and thank you for tuning into this show. We're presented by the GSMC Sports Network, as always. Your support does mean a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show. Leave a positive review. It really does make a difference. We also invite you to follow us on all of the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, X, not Twitter, but TikTok and Instagram, for more content and updates. So thank you once again, and we will see you guys tomorrow for our Friday show. We're going to have a lot of interesting information going out on that show. So I look forward to that and look forward to hearing from you guys in between then, and then, of course, during the show tomorrow. So, all right, guys, thanks again, and have a wonderful night.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to